The Executive Director, Leon Lowe, of the Free Market Foundation, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
I have an unusual challenge here. I normally have a CV when I introduce somebody. For Dave, or what I call him nowadays, Chairman Dave, is I have two CVs, and both are long, so I'm not sure how to handle that. What I'm going to do is sort of dip into each and choose a bit out of them. All the free market people here, it says to me that he's not a free marketeer. So what he is, we don't know, but that's why I call him Chairman Dave. And in the language of the school of thought I used to belong to, he would be called Com-Chair. The other thing I should say about him is, by way of a brief introduction, is one of the brighter people we all know is Andrew Kenny. And Andrew Kenny is Dave's greatest praise singer. Dave probably doesn't know this. This is the first he's hearing of it. Andrew Kenny says he thinks Dave has the highest IQ of anyone he knows. He considers Dave to be the brightest person he's ever communicated with, interacted with. And that's very considerable praise. He was telling me that, so I knew that I was somewhere down the order. So mic's not switched. Is it on now? There we go.
Yeah.
The ones I can't say, did anyone at the back hear me? Because if they didn't hear me, they wouldn't have known if they heard me. But there we are. Dave is a good friend of ours, despite being not one of us philosophically and ideologically. But he'll get there. He's still young. He's got a while to go. I'll just something personal firstly before his formidable and intimidating CV. He was born in 54. He has 3 grandchildren, 4 dogs, 2 daughters, and 1 wife, apparently. And there's a very considerable pecking order in his household, I gather. And he's somewhere down the order of the household. He's a sort of glorified driver, he says. Dave is originally from the UK, immigrated to South Africa, and I must say has become a truly wonderful South African. Those of us who are South African through and through, can easily embrace him into our family, which doesn't often happen with people considered originally foreigners. He started off in 1971 as a naval engineering officer in nuclear attack submarines. So, as I like to point out, nuclear power plants have been around for a long time. Dave used to put them in submarines. And then he became managing director of a small family manufacturing firm in the UK. When he came to South Africa in '84, he joined Eskom, and he has spent most of his working life in Eskom in very senior and sometimes controversial positions. He started off with developing Eskom's competence-based competence in probabilistic safety analysis. A lot of his CV is about his role in nuclear safety, and he was responsible, for example, for the engineering activities at Koeberg. He was responsible for the pebble bed reactor development. He was responsible for Eskom's new build nuclear power plan, which might or might not be implemented at some stage. And he's had a very formidable life involved in the group that studied the nuclear safety elements of Fukushima, and is internationally recognized as being chair or on various international eminent boards and committees and projects. So he is highly qualified in his field of nuclear engineering and nuclear physics. That's not what he's here to talk about tonight. He's here to talk about Eskom, where he spent most of his working career, and to tell us stuff about the energy landscape and climate in South Africa. So we're very lucky to have Dub. The turnout here is testimony to him. We very rarely have such a packed room, and thank you Doug, and thank you for attending. Doug. Dave, Comrade Dave, Chair Dave, please come and address us.
Am I turned on? Is the machine?
Tell us who
No, I've got to sing. That sounds good. No. I'm not. No, don't go there. I sent a note to someone this morning saying that can I be available Friday morning. I said no, I'm tied up, and they said, oh, that sounds exciting. I want to start with a denial. Thank you for the introduction. I'm somewhat embarrassed by Andrew's views. But thank you for the introduction. I will comment one thing is that when this lecture was all organised was initially about the middle of last year, I think we started talking about it. And I was clearly then a retiree from Eskom. I left Eskom at the end of 2018. And of course, the chair discussions, because I had an email at 11:07 Friday 2 weeks ago, which I briefly read on my tablet, which said, good morning, you're a director of Nexa. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Okay, fine. Went to bed, 11 at night. Next morning, I printed it out and I read it again. It said, you're director and chairperson. So I want to comment, this is nothing to do with Nexa. The presentation doesn't mention the word nuclear. If you ask questions, that's different. But at the moment, the presentation is not about nuclear. The presentation is from somebody who actually joined Eskom in '84 and left in '98. I joined before Ian McRae became chief executive. And I left just over a year ago in the middle of what we now know going on. And I spent that time looking at what Eskom was doing and what the energy market was doing. And I was, one of my passions is to look at the industry I'm in. And so what I'm trying to discuss is, everyone accepts an electricity crisis. Everyone keeps saying, well, is it over next week or the week after? And was it caused by the last person or 2 years ago? Was it Eskom's last chairman or the chairman before? Now, let's comment one thing quick before I start, is that if you think about Eskom, if you've got somebody who works for you and you're appointing the new, let's say you're on a school board and you appoint a new principal, and he doesn't work, you fire and get another principal, and you get another principal. And if you've gone through 12 principals in 3 years, the problem isn't the principals. Eskom's gone through 12 CEOs in 10 years. That is not the problem of the CEOs. And I will comment at the moment we're sitting in a situation now which says the underlying cause of the problem we're sitting with is not understood. Hence the problem which Alistair De Ruyter, I've never met, is now saying maybe we should slow down on this restructuring discussion. And I guarantee he's annoyed some of the government doing that, because that's policy. And if policy is the problem, it doesn't matter how good a chairman or a CEO of Eskom you are, you've got a challenge. So I'll try and go through some presentation, and I'll try and make sense of this. And it'll be all graphs, I apologize. Graphs and me talking, that sounds really boring. Let's first of all go to a simple graph. And this simple graph says, what is the load growth in South Africa? And this you can't read it. The person at the back should be able to tell me a spelling mistake, bottom right-hand corner. No, what this is, that line there, that is the Eskom annual peaks. This is Eskom annual report. Nothing in this presentation is really secret, or you couldn't find out if you did some research. And it grows from 1982, what are we? Something like 16,000 megawatts peak, to 2007, something like 37,000 megawatts peak. And if you were doing your MBA or anything else useful, you'd put a curve through that and you'd say that's about a 3.4% compound growth rate. And you would argue, well, is that a function of a really good economy? And I'd argue if you stood here in 1782, end of the gold boom, and 2007, that I'd argue that we went into model economy. We were doing okay sometimes, not so well other times. But if you want external stresses, they existed in the middle of this thing. We had gold price collapse to 280 rand dollar, 280 rand an ounce. We had the exchange rate collapse. We had a few border wars. We had emergency. So it looks like 3.4% is a good number. So if I'm now standing in 2007, which is here, and I'm asked to project forward, what do I get? I get a load demand in 2018, and I said this presentation started last year, so the dates are a year out of date, so I apologize for that, of 54,000 megawatts. So 2007, forget all the clever planners, just project the current compound growth rate for the last 25 years into the future, and you get 54,000 megawatts demand today. What did we get? We got that. And the problem you've got with that is the first problem, just of interest, why I'm trying to say the schedules are long, and you'll find all my graphs have nice long schedules. They don't talk about the last 36 months or 8 months or 4 weeks or anything else. They talk about the last 20, 30 years. Is that if you say, but the economy changed here, I'm going to argue, you mean it was worse than having a border war going full blast about here somewhere? It was worse than the interest rates of 25% in 84? No, it wasn't. The one thing that changed it was this. Those blue lines are actually, it's a different scale, by the way, in case you worry, it is a different scale. That scale. This actually, from Eskom annual report, is the load reductions we took place at those peaks. So it says that for the first time in 2006, we shed 650 megawatts at peak. We turned somebody off, probably a smelter. And we reported that for a couple of years and then stopped reporting it because it got too common for words after that. So we didn't hit 54,000, we hit 35,000 megawatts. That difference, by the way, in my opinion, and I'll come back to it, is heavy industry that we haven't got. And it's worth bearing in mind that in 2006, what caused that line was in 2006, industry was told we cannot supply the power you want. And I would defy anybody in this room to go to their managing board and say, I want to invest in a brand new manufacturing plant using 40 megawatts. And they say, where's the power coming from? And say, we don't know. We can't trust Eskom. And they'll say, go away, build that plant out of Mongolia. Anywhere but here. If you've got 4 shafts on your gold mine and you can't run more than 3 of them because there is no power for the 4th one, do you sink another shaft? And that's the basis. You've now had the whole talk, by the way. It's more complicated. Okay, and just of interest, if you assume that from that point onwards we'd achieved not 3.5 but 2.5, we'd have hit 49,000 megawatts last year. And if you only 1.5%, we'd have hit 44,000 megawatts. I can tell you now, if you get Eskom reports and you work out what that increase in sales due to our tariff, it would mean the tariff would have been far lower. The tariff is being driven by lack of sales. It's your cost divided by your sales. Most of Eskom's costs are fixed. If you don't believe that, the price of the coal that's making the kilowatt hour for that light bulb is 30 cents a unit. FMF is paying 2 rand a unit. Think of it, the variable cost is 15% of the cost of power. Right? Just worth bearing in mind. Of course, if you're in Cape Town, it's nuclear, and that's only about 4 cents, but I'll pass on that bit. What comes out of this very simply is a statement which says that from 2007 onwards, supply determined consumption from 2007. Anybody who uses the word demand for power post-2007 is fooling themselves. Because the supply is supply consumption. I'll show it later. Okay, but we all knew, and we're told this regularly, and I was told in Eskom a lot, is that don't worry, the world has changed post the 2008 crisis, that the world changed, energy's leveled off, the old world is the new world, the world is there, the 4IR is there, whatever you want to use this week. Unfortunately, it's not true. This is, you'll see most of my graphs have sort of statements of where they came from. I don't understand my own data, so I try and use other guys' data. So this is BP Statistical Review. And what that says to you is, yes, you can see 2008, the crisis. There it is, absolutely clear. You can see the growth going on beyond that. So anyone who says that we slowed down because of the 2008 crisis is talking rubbish. It's even worse than that. What the 2008 crisis did do was it drove the capital price of money to virtually zero. If you want to borrow money on the world market today, you are ending up paying a real cost of capital of very close to zero or maybe even negative. So the cost of financing major projects went away. But nothing was built, no power was used. Actually, it's slightly worse than that because these are 2 lines, and I hope you can see both of them because it's wonderful on your PC, things look larger and brighter. But what you can see is this is the curve here of the OECD countries. And there's 2008, there's today, and there's 1974. And for those who don't know it, the OECD countries is the industrialized countries. That's the USA, Canada, European states, South Korea, Japan, Australia. And if you look at them, you can say, yes, look at that. That's exactly what happened to us. We've leveled off. Yeah. Their problems are they have no unemployment, and they're deindustrializing because they're going to service industry because of their high-tech stuff. If you seriously believe that's our country, then go down out the building, turn left, and drive down to Alex and tell me that you're in a first world country and unemployments are below 5%. Because the non-OECD country, that's everybody else, did this. There is 2008, and that's that. And you might say, but what does that really mean for the economy? So you've said some wonderful things as an electrical engineer, talking about electrical issues. Let's just talk about, has the economy been really affected? So the first answer is you drag some stats from SA Stats. And this is quite interesting. This actually happens to be the red line. I took the blue line because the two things we do in this country really is we mine and we manufacture. We're heavy engineering. If you believe otherwise, you live in Santon and believe in the bubble and believe in 4IR. But essentially what we do is we manufacture and we mine and we smelt. Clearly we can see mining collapsing and we understand that, but there's a very interesting little disaster here which happened. But what's really interesting is the percentage of GDP that is made up by manufacturing. And what you can see absolutely clearly is that it was pretty sitting level at about 15.5% of our GDP, which is not a bad number, is in manufacturing. Up until something happened. Then it goes down. And if you believe we can win by being the clever people and the 4IR people, then it's great. I'm not convinced of that. Something happened here. And that something drove this. And this was lack of investment in new heavy plant. Because why do you invest in heavy plant when you can't put power into it? GDP, this is the World Bank. Again, pretty positive. There's South Africa growing. This is going from 1990. Thank you, I can read better than I can. 1990. I can always check, the kink is about 2008, brother. Don't worry, just we correlate with the. And there's the growth rate. Very nice. That's in purchasing power, but which goes up nicely. Small detail is that's the curve we were on before we hit 2007, which, by the way, was the date when Eskom said in the 1990s we'll have no power left. And that's the thing we actually have achieved since then. And the rest of the world hasn't done that. The world has not slowed down in the last. We've had a little blip in 2008. And that's 25% of GDP. And just of interest, you want to put it a different way. This is another graph I found from somebody else now. I also forget who it's from now. It says somewhere down here. IMF, seems a reasonable company. This is our GDP per head. You can see the pickup post the end of apartheid. 2008. Oh, yes. And then we do that. And I am going back to the point that 2008 was when energy went out. So if you believe all that lot, and I do, it's not the only reason, there are other reasons, but it dominates. Someone will say it's the missing 9 years. It's a lost, lost 9 years? Is that the buzzword? Well, I must admit, I think Zoom is brilliant on that basis, because he caused load shedding 2 years before he came into power. We started load shedding in 2007, he took over in 2009, is that right? No. He must be a genius to have load shedding 2 years before he takes over. But why didn't we build? What went wrong with the decision in the mid-1990s? Now, just for those who missed it, Eskom, in about the mid-90s, well, let me go on, explain. So this is, the first thing to say is that in the mid-1990s, Eskom was sitting with excess capacity, and I'll come back in a second, and a view by certain people in the organization that we would be running out of power in 2007. And that appeared quite strongly in the 98 energy policy. And Eskom went to government and said, we want to build more power stations. And at that point, what was going on was that in the world as a whole, there was a move towards independent power producers. Right? And let me explain, if you've got excess capacity, first of all, your average cost of power is about 70% driven by the capital cost you've invested. Debt dominates a utility business, always does. And therefore, the cost of debt is vital. I'll come back to that a bit later. So what happened was the free market was saying, we've got excess capacity in the world, therefore it is worth you selling us your power stations and we'll run them very efficiently. Because I can bring the price of power down, which was a myth, because what's really happening was the price was coming down because nobody was spending capital money on plant. Because there was an excess capacity from the whole of the first world who had boomed until the mid-1980s, and then they'd had the collapse following the oil shocks of the late 70s. Excess capacity, therefore it's worth doing it. Also brought natural gas in, which had low capital costs, high fuel costs. So along in about 96 to 98, people were coming along and talking about, well, shouldn't the free market get involved in this discussion? And I see Doug Cooney here somewhere. Does he, Doug? Hello, Doug. He and I had arguments on corridors on a regular basis on this one, so I've got the stage, Doug, shut up. But what also happened was, you saw that graph earlier, it's the same graph. What you can see is that for a period from 96 to 98, from 96 to 98, there was no growth. And people think in short-term memories. Most management teams think over a period of a couple of years. You start asking some management to talk about 10 years ago, so that's the old days. The world's changed. I always have economists who tell me the world has changed. I say, do they read Adam Smith as a book? And they go, yes, he's the Bible, 17-something. So he hasn't changed, but everything else has changed. But what happened was that we sat here about here discussing, should we build more plant? Now, you've got a situation in Eskom at this point. It's very important to understand. Eskom was not bursting to build plant. Eskom was sitting with a small number of guys who were the engineers, I would argue that the logical thinkers, but I was one of them, saying, we must start building now. And we had massive excess capacity. We said the lead time is going to mean that by 2007, we're sitting in a crisis. But you're sitting there with a pile of financial people whose view is the next quarter's important, the next year's pretty important, but beyond that, who cares? And they were looking at this kind of profile of demand, in other words, flat, with an excess capacity of like 30, 40%. And they were saying, I can't go to the board and ask for money. So when Eskom went, so let me get into some more. So let's look at that in more detail. Let's look at what the stress on the company is. Now, there's a wonderful phrase called the net reserve margin. I'm afraid I'm going to chuck some ideas at this meeting, which you don't worry about. There's no exam at the end. I don't think there is anyway. But the net reserve margin is not something Eskom used to work out very much. They used to talk about excess capacity. But what it really is the difference between the installed capacity, which is that green line, and the maximum sent out of the year. Right, as expressed. So you've got 15% excess or 20% excess. Not an excess, it's just you've got to have a reserve margin. And you can model that, and you can see it as the stress on the company. In other words, depending on how big that number is, depends on how stressed you are. And companies do have a company stress. You're staying awake at night, and I'll show them a bit later. So what then happens is this. So we're sitting in Eskom between 92 and 96, shall we say, with this calculation going down and down and down. And Eskom is saying, we better think about building some more plants. There was a plant called Lekwe. I think it was Lekwe, and it was next to Letabo. It was 6 machines, dry-cooled. I remember the spec coming out of Alicam at the time. Eskom was saying we should build this thing because we're going to hit a problem. So that goes to 96. There's the same graph there with the level off there. We then have the change of government. Everyone's starting to think about more important issues than mere electrical engineers. And what then happens to us is we do something really clever. We invent a thing called 97.3. And I see Doug smiling at that one. 97.3 was a brilliant move, and I do think it was a brilliant move, so don't misunderstand me on that one. It was a brilliant move by Bruce Cooks, who was one of the great generation managers of Eskom, who said we should take our plant that's achieving 80% availability, or not 75%, and move it up to 90% availability, of which 7% unavailability is planned, and 3% is unplanned. You've all heard about EAF and UCLF, and well, he was saying 90% energy availability, 7% planned maintenance, and 3% unplanned, which actually was quite a nice target. It was a really good target to go for. And we had a strong improvement. So if you think of the stress in the company, we suddenly appear to be sitting much better with this new plan in the place of increasing availability. Except that this red line has nothing to do with plant availability. It's merely a calculation of installed versus actual. What was actually happening was we had Majuba coming online. Now, Majuba was the last of the 6-packs, deferred as far as we could into the future, but finally being finished off between 96 and 2000, roughly. And therefore, we're adding 4,000 megawatts to the system, which therefore makes the numbers different. And we had a flat line on growth. So just at the time we should be making very big noises about we need to start building things, the gut feel was we'd fix the problem by better availability. We had no growth potential. The belief there's no growth in the future is a common one in utilities. Utility financial departments always have that view, because building the new power stations always lose money. The new stations always lose money. The ones that are middle-aged make a fortune. The ones at the end of their life lose money. Simple as that. The ones at the end, I'll come back later. So we had a view that when the government came along in 1998 and said, we're not going to build, we're going to give all the building to somebody else, Eskom said, thank heavens for that. There was a few guys complaining, but the comment that Eskom went to the government and said we should be allowed to build, I believe, is actually a slight misnomer. You know when the boss tells you, when you think something he's doing, which is a bit messy, and you ask the boss, should I do it? And he says, no, don't do it, we don't need to do it. You take that email and you put it away. Because you know that 6 months from now, when the thing falls apart, and he says, it was your job to fix it, you say, you told me not to, boss. You don't argue too much because it's a messy job. That's what happened to Eskom. Eskom at this point was saying, we don't really want, we would like to build new power stations, but if you've told us not to, that's okay, we'll obey. And the free market, to come back to my friend over here who says I'm not free market, I believe in a mixed economy. There's some things should be free, some things should be state controlled. Just live with me on that one. I'm sorry, Leon, you have to live with it. I've actually converted Andrew to that view of life, so it's not doing too badly. So the answer to the question is the free market was going to build power stations, and we then had the 90-year energy policy, which actually said, by the way, that there would be an ISMO, to use the classic buzzword, but the ISMO wouldn't take contracts to supply power. It was merely a trading house. You, as a customer, would approach a supplier, contract with him, and he would wheel through it to the ISMO. So the ISMO had no balance sheet. It was just ran the grid. Not what they're talking about nowadays, which is where the ISMO actually takes contracts to provide power and has contracts with suppliers. So I'll leave some financial guys to work out what guarantees are required to cover that discussion, but it's interesting. So that's where we were. And the view taken in the 96-97 period was we really don't need any more power stations. We never need any more power stations. We'll sign contracts for 25 years with smelters at very low cost, because that'll make money for us, because we've got no excess capacity, and there is no growth left in the economy. You can argue Eskom at that point was not being very pro-South Africa. Its view was the economy was not going anywhere. Now, I just moved this. You'll find it moves the graph a bit farther out. And what happened was not surprising. We have a flat line here. I mentioned earlier, there's nothing coming online. And we go on growing. Look at that nice sort of curve fit there. 2005, things get pretty grim. By 2006, 5-6, we are in desperation in Eskom, and we are saying to customers, you cannot build your shopping complex because you won't connect you. Let's go back a bit. So we just had this thing here which says what's happening down here in terms of, that's a theoretical, this is a theoretical calculation I've given you. You know, it just says peak, 100,000 megawatts installed, I've sent out of 90,000, this is some. What does that mean? What did it mean in the company? Let me give you a couple of little graphs that may intrigue you. If you want to, I will ask you to bring your standard 8 son or grandson. Sorry, grade 10, I must get it right. I'm sorry, I'm too old. Your grade 10 son or grandson or daughter. Don't mind, maths is better with daughters. This is an interesting graph. This is just one that comes out as an example of inside Eskom. This was a calculation done every morning at 6 in the morning. Eskom declares to the system how many of its, we call them 6-pack units, that's Majuba or Madupi or one of the big units, how many of them are in cold reserve? Now, cold reserve at 6 in the morning means that the national control is not calling that plant up to run that day. So to use the example of a bus company, it's the buses in the garage that no one's using that day. It's not being repaired, it's not being run, it's just spare for emergency. And this is just simply a plot of the 12-month moving average of that. Now, let me put a thought to you which says, going back to your grade 10 offspring, if I asked him about here, where are we going? He would say, this line's going to go through 0 sometime about the beginning of 2008. Yes? Anyone remember the beginning of 2008? It was a bad time for the economy because Eskom turned the lights out. So it wasn't like some rocket science coming along here. Yes, there were issues in terms of coal and everything else, but ultimately, when you've got no buses in the garage and a bus breaks down, you turn around and say, there is no bus service. You can't invent buses, you can't invent power stations. But another way, this is another graph, this is just simply emergency generation orders. This is where Eskom turns around to the system and says, we have had a small disaster, please make sure your machine doesn't... It's not mine. Oh, Jane. Sorry, no, it wasn't Jane. So I apologise. I'll pick on Jane, but I won't pick on you. Sorry. Failure of the test. This is a different graph. This just simply says Eskom has a thing called emergency generation order 1s called EL1s. And what that means is you send an EL1 out to the fleet and it says, do not do maintenance, do not touch your plant, don't do anything, go to full power and stay there because the grid is in a challenge. If you go back to the mid-1990s, we'd have these about 3 or 4 times a year. There were always sort of major issues of, oh my good grief, Letabo lost 4 units at once, the grid's in a disaster. This is the cumulative graph for 2004. So there we are, over the days from 1st of January to Thursday, it rose to about 20 of them. 2005, we rose to about 50. 2006, we rose to about, what are we there, about 90. 2007, we were running 1 every working day. So every working day, every power station was told, stop doing maintenance, do not touch anything, go to full power, do not do what you're doing. Power station manager, get up, go to the power station, sit in the control room. Do not go home. So this wasn't some unsurprising shock horror thing. This is the actual plant performance of Coburg from... Did I say Coburg? I apologise, I'm not talking Coburg. Of the Eskom fleet, you've heard of the phrase energy availability factor. It's been, I think we've all trained everyone on energy things nowadays. This is the 12-month moving average, is the dark blue line. The light blue line is monthly. You can see that we cycle over the year, and in mid-summer we're doing more maintenance, and in midwinter we're doing little maintenance. That's why it's sort of a up and down consistent thing. What you can see though is the performance of the plant, and you can see here's 2001 excess capacity, and we beat, there's 90%. We were sitting up at 93% annual availability factor. It was an ego trip to get your availability factor as high as you possibly could on a power station, which also meant you didn't do maintenance. Because in reality, we never got down to 3% unplanned availability. We ended up with something like 2 or 3% planned maintenance here. And our comment, this is like buying a motor car. You buy a brand new motor car, you put on the road, and if you decide not to do maintenance or do minimal maintenance, it'll do fine for the first 70,000 K. Then problems start. We ran our coal fleet like a series of combi taxis. And we claimed availability. And what you can see here is the availability falling, coming down to level to about 85%, which is probably more reasonable. Long-term number, 85% is a good number for a coal fleet to achieve. Let's not kid ourselves, you know, it's a very good number, 85%. But then what happened was a couple of things. The first thing was, I said in 2007, we stopped having any space on the system. What that meant was that there was nothing in your coach company, there was no bus in the garage. So if a bus rang up and said, I've got a problem on the plant, you said, keep driving until you break. In the old days, going back to 2003, 2004, the answer was, if a coal station rang up and said, I've got a boiler tube leak, the only question from national control would be, can you last till after evening peak? The answer is yes, then just come off after evening peak, we'll bring up something else in the morning for you. Post 2007, the answer was stay on load. Can you live with it? And we had power station managers requiring to get approval from executive directors to take machines off load. But then you see this crash here doesn't occur. It occurs in about 2012, and you might say, but I just said that was 2007, but if your maintenance interval on a big station is about 6 years, a general overhaul is about 6 yearly. So if you don't do maintenance on your car, you can probably, on average, probably half a maintenance cycle before the average one starts seeing a problem. What you've also got is 2010, when Eskom, and you can see when Eskom was told, stop doing any maintenance at all, period, we've got a World Cup, do not take the plant off load. All this time, you've been running, keep the lights on as a big driver. Whatever you do, keep the lights on. Just a little digression, I won't go into the corruption discussion, but to do that, you end up telling people whatever you do is okay as long as it keeps the lights on. The company rules are therefore destroyed in the process. Many, many people use that to do the right thing, whatever's necessary. Some people don't. But the processes in the company were breaking down at this point, quite simply because you had no choice. The answer was you were on load on Monday morning, come what may. If you need something, you do it. And you steadily break down the culture in the organization of discipline. And if you do that, some people use it to advantage, some people are confused, and some people take advantage. So here is the collapse, which is really the result of us running without proper maintenance planning from 2007. And not running without maintenance planning because we didn't want to or because we didn't like to, but because you just couldn't do it. Your general overhaul would get moved. You would be told you're due into general overhaul in 3 weeks' time. We've just moved you out by 6 months. Which also turns around to your suppliers, because the general overhaul costs a couple hundred million rand sometimes. Your suppliers get told that contract we placed with you is now actually being deferred, and the penalty clause comes in. Because I've mobilized my troops to come on site and start fixing your power station, so you're paying my lost causes. So again, you're opening up the... But I'll move on about that. This little hemp here, I think this little hemp here is primarily the Majuba silo. For those who remember, the Majuba silo collapsed, took 2,000 megawatts out of the grid essentially. And that was just an act of, I don't say an act of God, but it was an act of, it was really unexpected and it was no particular... And this is the recovery which occurred when Mr. Molefe came in and Coco came in, and the answer to that one probably is that at this point we were being told we were completely useless and therefore your morale was shot. And I won't make any other comments on Mr. Molefe or Mr. Coco, but I will comment that at this point we were told we were great, we were going to make it happen. And that stopped. And then we've got this. And I can tell you in this period here, people complained recently in the press about the fact that Eskom stopped doing maintenance. We should do maintenance. It's very easy to say that. But there was no money. Literally, you were not allowed to fund your money for your general overhaul wasn't released sometimes until a few weeks before the overhaul started. Think about it. The money for the overhaul is not released until a few weeks before. You want to order a spare part that takes 18 months to build. So you go into the overhaul and you've got no chance of getting that spare part. So you end up doing the overhaul the best you can and you come out without the spare part. Financial crisis, and you can argue where it's going, but that stops in January 2020. I'm sorry, we're no more modern than that. I apologize for not being further ahead than that, but I can't be. That comes later. So, but just a second. I've said that we had no growth in demand, or no, my own mistake, no growth in electricity delivery from 2007. And yet we brought on stream most of Medupi and most of Kasili. So what's happening? So this is the same graph again. I told you this get longer and longer. I'm afraid I can't go beyond 2017. I haven't got the one for 2045. But I have something similar in a second. So this is the same graph. What you can see here is that here's the demand not improving, to put it mildly. And here's the new installed capacity. And there you can see the return to service stations coming in. And then you can see the Medupi Kasili starting to come in. So the reserve margin gets back to where it was back in 2097. So surely the problems should all go away, shouldn't they? That's the obvious question. And if you read some of the tweets from certain people, they'll tell you that it's just a question of going and kicking butt. And it's worse than that, because in about 2002, we brought back in Cahora Bassa, which isn't in these numbers because Cahora Bassa is a contract externally, and the power lines to Cahora Bassa were destroyed in the 1980s, were restored in about early 2000s, so I don't claim the exact date. But essentially that would actually move the reserve margin much nicer. So we're sitting with reserve margins that are back to 1993, when there was no load shedding. So why the heck aren't we doing it better? Well, I come back to my discussion of the combi taxi, because this is the yearly graph of that graph I showed you earlier, which had the monthly one. This is just the yearly one. And what this shows you is that here is the unavailable. Oops, sorry. Go back. Mustn't get ahead of myself. This is just simply the unavailable. You can see a nice falling line, collapse, recovery, and that recovery was transitory. I think what can be said about this recovery is people will say, well, couldn't we just go back to that? And I think it was then when you're flogging your dead horse, it does get up a bit. And if you threaten it with death and destruction, it will make another 100 yards before it falls over and dies. So maybe we're in that situation. I don't know, that's a discussion you could have with it, but I'll come back in a second to that one. So what then you do is a little bit, which is not actually ethically the correct answer, because reserve margin doesn't include it, but if you just correct the reserve margin by saying, let's assume the reserve margin is corrected to what it would be for a 90% available fleet, you get that line there. Let's just get rid of, and that's the impact of the availability of the old plant. Which is that graph, just some graph, just made it nice and purple because I like purple. I don't actually, but my granddaughter does. What's interesting is that what you can now see is that this is a quote from the IRP 2010, which says the international net reserve margin range is 15 to 25%. So that's where you should be if you're a good utility. Anywhere above that, and you've got too much plant. Below that plant, and you're in danger. Now, just a quick question. If you believe my sums here, then you will tell me I should be having load shedding in about 2007, 2008. I think that's about right. We should have load shedding in about 2014. About right. And if you look at the present availability, if you just go back a few slides, oh no, I don't mean to go there. That was my future graph. If you go back to this lot, you will see that I've stopped this graph about here somewhere. That's 2017 actually. But if you go down to here, we should be seeing load shedding off the edge of the graph about here somewhere. So, make sense so far? Sorry, I've just gone messy again. Apologise for not being a good presenter. What does the future hold? First point I'll make is it essentially takes 10 years to do the project development, contracting, permitting, construction, commissioning of a large generation plant. Because that's just nuclear. No, gas is faster than that. Or hydro is faster than that. Or coal is faster than that. No. And in this country at the moment, and I would try and avoid being a nuclear fundy until later if you ask questions, but nuclear is like 10 years away from commissioning because we've done all the homework beforehand. We've got probably 2 years contracting, then 8 years building. Coal station, want to start a coal station? Your EIA will take you like the next few years. Raising money will take you maybe forever. Ask the IPPs. And building isn't that easy. Gas is simple to build. So I can put gas turbines tomorrow morning, inside 2 years, but I need some gas to feed it. So I've got to have a gas supply, regasification plants, storage plants, contracts to do all this lot. Who's taking which risk, and I would bet you a small amount of money, not a big amount, I'm too poor, a small amount of money that it will take several years to sort out the contracting for a gas project. It isn't the time to build it, but even when you've built it, then the question is who's guaranteeing the return and investment on the gas storage system, because if gas is intermittent. Hydro, I'm sorry we haven't got any hydro. I love Grand Inga. If I lived in Kinshasa, it would be a great project. But until you can move Grand Inga project to the Free State, I'm not that hopeful. You've got to first of all create a country called Congo to actually have a government. But anyway, so the short answer is 10 years. This is my central thing. My other thought takeaway is that, quite bluntly, the present IRP says we are doing the work until 2030, and beyond that, we're not quite sure. And the trouble with that is that anything credible is post-2030. Coal 3, nuclear 1, the major gas projects, hydro, it's all 2030, 30, that sort of range. So they've avoided the debate by cutting it off at a point. But it doesn't help us, because to have a power station online in 2031 requires you to start now. This is not like buying something at Walmart. So what does the future hold? And this is my last few graphs for you. Here is a little graph which may intrigue you. This is called the famous waterfall. It used to be called the tabletop, the table mountain graph. Let me explain what it is. What it is it's a stacked graph with all the Eskom power stations. Here we go: Arnott, Camden, Dover, Kortve, Hendrina, Kendal, Kamati, Kriel, Lutabo, Bajuba, Matimba, Matla, Tuga, Kuburg. And it used to be a graph which, if you went this side, showed you coming up from a low base up to a high base. And the answer was you had Table Mountain, it went up there, and then you, in the past you were saying, what will happen when there's a gap between supply and demand? And every station then comes out of here as it meets the end of life. And I'll put a very strong comment which says that the current Eskom performance shows quite clearly that the 50-year life on the power station is about the end of life. In other words, at that point, the plant is basically dead. You may people talk about repowering power stations. I suppose it's about, and if you say, well, Kamati is virtually dead, should we repower it? Let's change the euphemism. Repowering, it means take a bulldozer, flatten the whole damn site, and build something new. It does not mean going and putting a new spark plug in it, right? This is your combi taxi. It's like you going out now into the middle of Alex and saying, I'm choosing a combi taxi, which is getting to the end of life, and I'm going to refurbish it to make it new. You take it to the garage, Toyota, and they'll say, please, sir, just scrap it and buy a new one. Same discussion exactly. These stations have been run. You can run a Toyota Combi until 400,000 K beautifully and maintain it wonderfully. I'm not debating that. But if you don't maintain it for the first half of its life, you cannot recover it in the last half of its life. That's what we're talking about here. So all the talk about, oh, but somebody else in the world has run a station to 70 years is like, yeah, so? Did they maintain it early? Yes. So what we're looking at here is very interesting. We're looking at the fact that, and I mentioned earlier, we've stopped industrial growth because of the lack of forethought in 98. Well, it gets worse than that. Because, and by the way, of interest, Eskom in about 2008 essentially decided under the current system it couldn't afford to build the future power stations. So the project for Coal 3, Coal 4, which is post Medupi-Kusile, the second pump storage scheme, which is Steenbras, I think, Nuclear 1, Nuclear 2 were all cancelled because there was no money. So the plant that was there to fill the hole I'm about to show you was all cancelled in 2008. End of 2008. We used the financial excuse. What you've got here is all the power stations, and you can see they come along and they disappear. There is Matla, will shut down in about 2029 according to its age at 50 years old. Coburg lasts a bit longer. It's got a 60-year life, and I can. There you've got Tutuka and so on. What you can see is that what we've got is Medupi coming in and Kusile coming in. And they've been unreliable at the beginning, and this is classical reliability theory. If you think about anything you buy it, there's that risk in the first few days it breaks, then it settles down and is reliable for most of its life, and then you get to the point where it's starting to wear out and it gets more and more expensive to maintain. That is true of all. That's called the bathtub curve, and I'll show it in a second and what it means. So as they come in, Medupi-Kusile, they've been coming in. We've been learning a lot to put them in place, but essentially their unavailability has been horrendous. They'll get better. What this actually tells you is that by 2028, now I mentioned 10 years is the lead time for a big project. We haven't committed to any of them yet. We're going to start having not a situation of saying you cannot build your new industrial plant because there's no power. It's you cannot run your current industrial plant because there's no power. Right? And then it goes on going down. But let's look at it slightly differently. This is the same graph, expressed slightly differently, which is simply the average age of the power station. So there we've got two stations. This is today, one at 0, one at a year. You may guess that's Medupi and Kusile. Average because there's 6 units. They've got, Kusile got, and here we've got the older stations. And this is probably Kamati over here at 48 years old. If you now suddenly put on top of this a little chart which looks at the bathtub curve I mentioned earlier, which is a classical reliability curve which you see in anything you deal with, when you buy a brand new thingy, you have a burn-in phase when things may go wrong. The better you engineer it, the more you've made several, the smaller that is. But when you buy your cell phone, it says 7 days return. Well, that means if out of the box it doesn't work, you take it back. And the 7 days is the burn-in time. And clearly, the better you are, the less that is. But that's one line. Then you've got the period of steady state, the plants, fat, dumb, and happy, middle-aged, running well. Think of your motor car. You've debugged all the problems that Volkswagen built into it for you, or in my case, Volvo, and you're now getting rid of it. It's nice. And then you get that stage with your motor car when it starts getting worn out. This is very classical. It's called the bathtub curve because it looks like a bathtub, for those who haven't seen it before. It's very standard. It's not a very difficult concept. And you can argue what that line is and what angle they're at, but that's roughly speaking where it is. I'm not trying to put numbers. What does this tell us? It tells Eskom's currently sitting in probably the worst place it could be. Medupi-Kusile are right in the beginning of learning. I've got no doubt Medupi-Kusile will be very good stations in a few years' time. And when someone says, but the old stations were more reliable, I remember Eskom trying to give Kendal Power Station back to the vendors. It was so unreliable, we tried to give it away. We said, you've handed it over, but the American boiler and the European turbines don't talk. And every time the boiler says good morning, the turbine says goodbye. And we had about 100 trips in a month or something ridiculous. It was quite insane. We fixed it. Majuba was the same. When it first came on stream, there was a joke about how many trips Majuba had in the first year. It was just unbelievable. So it's not as though it's an unknown thing. And all the problem, when someone says to me, well, there's 8 billion rands of fix-its, of requirement to fix Medupi Kasili. I've heard that number knocking around, I may be wrong. My comment will be, so? It's a snag list. You spent 400 billion rand buying these 2 units. You're paying 4% on the snag list. And a 4% snag list isn't too bad. A lot of money. I mean, everything in the power business is a lot of money. As soon as you say a power station, you can think, dollars come up, or euros or yen or whatever it is you can use this week. And we've got these lot in the burnout phase, and I think that's pretty obvious. We can see the fact that the unavailability of our stations is to some extent linked to their age, and I can debate it's also partly coal supply and other things, but essentially if you rank the Eskom stations by age and availability, you find a pretty good correlation. That's today. That's 2030. 2030, you're going to see Medupi Kasili, like Kendall became, absolute stars. They're going to take a medal for being reliable, performing beautifully, because they're fundamentally well-engineered stations. They've got problems. I'm not debating that for a second, but they'll fix them. They'll complain about them in years to come. And every Eskom coal station's had problems. Every single one has had crises of when it was first built, there was some horrible problem we couldn't fix. They've all come out of that. And you can see this lot marching into the distance. There's not much over here at the moment. And you might ask, but surely we were better in the past, and does this explain the great performance of Eskom in 2000? There's the same graph in 2000. All Eskom stations they've all settled in, the last one being Majuba, and they're all sitting fat, dumb and happy. They're your motor car with 70,000 K on the clock, between 20 and 70,000 K on the clock. So, I haven't got a brilliant conclusion, except to say one thing, and that is that big power stations are the way you feed grids. And people will tell me, but I'm an old-fashioned, white-haired, decrepit, take a pick of discussions. Base load, this is a wonderful discussion they now use. I've heard that being used against me. And the new renewables and distributed generation will save the world. And I say, that's great. And I then say, do you understand the cell phone analogy? And they go, what? And I say, cell phone. Cell phone. I'll put it down now because I can't carry heavy weights, an old person. If you think about it, in 1994, cell phones came into this country. At that point, the view was that it was an LSM 10 item. That there was a limited market, and could we afford to cover coverage over the entire country? If you had taken the person from Vodacom or MTN and said, I expect my domestic worker to have 2, and my gardener to have 1, and his son to have 3, they'd look at me and say, you're out of your skull. And yet that's what's happened. If you ask the guy in Central Africa, what is a telephone, he will say, this is the telephone. If you offer him a thing with a dial and a Bakelite lid and a cable, he'll go, what the heck's that? That technology has changed the world. There's no question. But it didn't change it on the back of massive government support and subsidies. In fact, the opposite. It created it because there was a real commercial reason why this is a better system than the old-fashioned pick the phone up, dial it, and speak to people. So if someone tells me that the future is, and I'll be blunt, is renewables and distributed generation and all these things, I'll say fine. Then why are they talking about building big grids in the middle of Africa? Why is any factory worried about power supply? If you seriously believe the solution is renewables, local grids, all that stuff, then the people complaining that we cannot build an industry because there is no power supply would not be worrying. They'd be saying, stuff you, Eskom. I will go build my own thing in my backyard. and we'd sort the regulation out. Let's not kid ourselves. The regulations are... The answer is they're not. The answer is if I go to Kenya and I say to Kenya, I've got a better way of installing your landline system for your telephones, they will look at me and go, what are you talking about? We don't have any landlines in Kenya. But if you go to them and say, I want to put a grid system in which is cost effective and reasonable, I'll say, yes, thank you, I'll talk to you. That is the difference. So my answer is that we as a country have got to start filling something in. So that when we get to here, there is a pile of blue lines over here coming in. And that requires, in my view, so my final comment is, it requires some kind of decision process pretty quickly. And I'm afraid I'm an old-fashioned. I believe you've got 4 options in the world that make sense for power generation. Only 4 options that have made power grids work in the world really work. One of those is coal. We've tried that, it works. Poland does that, it works. There's a few political problems on coal nowadays. The second is natural gas. That works brilliantly. We have one problem. We haven't got any. The third one is hydro. That works brilliantly. Ask the Norwegians, it's brilliant. Again, if you can do me some geological and you can move Grandinga from the Congo down to the Free State, that'll change my views. Or you've got nuclear. Don't care which you come up with. If you want to get 50,000 megawatts from Grandinga, work out a plan to do it. I'm not sure it's viable, but but for heaven's sake, stop discussing what is the right way, because this lot is falling off the edge of the universe. And we are not going into the 4IR. We are a country that is still absolutely locked into heavy industry, mining, smelting, heavy engineering. And if we believe otherwise, we're kidding ourselves. It might make sense in the middle of Santon on some nice tower in a breakaway. It doesn't make sense in Alexandria. And with that, I think I'll come to my last slide. Yep. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, questions, please. I'm sure there's a lot of questions in this room, so I'll ask 3 and then answer 3. So there, Adil, and there.
Me?
Yes.
Right. There's been a report that there's about 12 or 13 applications on the Ministry of Energy's desk waiting for permission to build their own private power. You won't sign it off. Do you have any comment on that?
Okay. My answer to that question is, let me just talk about, I'll put it in a domestic thing. I think we've got to separate 2 things out here. One is me as let's take Dave Nicholls, little retired gentleman. I look at my electric bill and I go, my God. I look at my roof and I say solar, right? And my son-in-law did this. He went and asked the question of the local installer, could he go off grid? And the guy came back with a quote for his house, which was £750,000. And he said, I'm not sure I can afford that. What about staying grid tied? And he came back with 150,000 rand and almost the same saving, right? And this is the problem. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know which, I can't comment on the details. I'm not in the government. I'm not, I'm just please. But my comment is, understand what's happening. I was at a conference recently where someone talked about the grid being a big battery, right? You've heard that sort of, we can, I'm going to trade power on the grid. And if the systems they're talking about are incoherent irregularity, and I'll explain what I'm going to say. Intermittency is every power station's intermittent. If you take your nuclear power station, I'm a nuclear man, and you run a really good nuclear station, you run for 18 months, you come down for 6 weeks, you go back again. You're intermittent. For 6 weeks, you're not there. Right? They're all intermittent. Nothing runs 24/7 for 5,000 years. However, the question is that intermittency correlated? If I put a solar panel on my roof, I make solar power when the sun's shining. I've heard that rumor. I don't make solar panel power now. If you assume that your tariff is correctly organized, then I can then say I will sell my excess electrons to the grid at midday, and I will buy missing ones from the grid at midnight. And the problem I've got with that is if my neighbor's also got a solar panel, he's trying to sell his stuff to the grid at midday, and he's trying to buy it from the grid at midnight. Unless your cables run to India and Brazil, which would solve the problem beautifully, we're not going to win this one. So Dave Nicholls makes a fortune by going for solar panels on his roof and bringing his bill down. The country loses. And I come back to it. That's the function, that 30 cents of that, if we forget gas turbines and other silly things, if we don't, just talk about Eskom running coal fleet, go back 20 years. The price of that kilowatt hour is 30 cents for the coal and R1.70 for the rest of it. So the answer is yes, it will solve your problem as a thing, but it won't solve the country's problem. But unfortunately, if you go for big power stations, you end up with a problem that's only funded by governments and states, and all the middlemen who make their fortune from all these things lose their money. Another discussion. Second one. So I'm going to really answer the question, but it's not as simple as it looks like. As long as you're better cut, if you want to go off grid, that's fine. If you want to cut the power cable to Eskom, you owe them nothing, that's fine. Do it. But don't say to me that I'm going to change my profile because that makes, I can game the system. Because then what you're doing is making money, and the people who are losing are the people who don't do that. So Alex loses out. Put a concept, if we go back to the correct way we should build, in other words, fixed part and variable part, then the guy in Alex is told he's paying 1,500 Rand a month for his connection and 30 cents a kilowatt hour. I will guarantee that will not go down well in Alex. It will go really down my house, I'll love it, because I'll make money from that. I'll do better by that. If you go back to proper financing, so I pay a fixed charge plus variable, I will do better. My bill will go down. He will riot.
Adil, you had a question?
Thanks a lot. My name is Adil. I just wanted to find out what impact did the de Villiers Commission, particularly the report on actually discouraging South Africa going into any more build programs, particularly industrial, etc., etc. Because your graph does indicate that when that decision was taken to say that stop the continued projected growth of infrastructure development, there was that indication in 1997 later on.
Okay.
And I'll ask the second one. Yeah.
Okay.
Work on that. Right?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, de Villiers Commission was 1982. I joined Eskom 84, which is just after the de Villiers Commission was, and that resulted in Eskom being restructured. And we had things like, we were suddenly told you had to have cost centers, you had to have cost recovery, accounting suddenly became really important. At that point, Eskom had been building against a 10% per annum growth rate. Let's just put it in context. Eskom was building against the growth rate of demand between, let's say, mid-70s to very early 80s. 10% per year demand growth rate. Do that, and a coal station takes 14 years from decision to build it, place mine contract first, everyone gets that wrong, to actually the last unit of the 6 being online. So you are trying to build with a 14-year view ahead against a 10% growth rate. All right? This gets a bit imposing. And then you turn around and find it falls from 10% to 3%, which I'm showing in the graph here. Because that's before the graph here. I didn't go back that far in history, Adele. I wasn't going to. So the answer was, at that point, we should have drawn our horns in. That was the correct answer. If we'd gone on building as we were building then, we'd have ended up with more power stations than you can have breakfast. We did overbuild. And in fact, I would personally argue that if you want to blame somebody, I've mentioned no names so far, so I'll now blame one of my heroes. Just in case you miss it, this is a really good guy. Ian McRae, in about 84, was asked, do we abandon Majuba? Right? We'd started to see the beginning of this gap only up on the system, and he said, do we abandon Majuba? And he'd just lived through 5 or 6 years of semi-load shedding, of heavy industry saying, I want to build a plant, and him being told, no, I can't connect you for 2 years. And so his view was, I'll always find the need for more power. Now, in a real sense, if Majuba had been cancelled in 84, we would have had less of a gap between the end of construction, realistically in the early 90s, and then required to build in the early 2000s. And so probably we'd had a better situation. But the basic principle of de Villiers, it was the correct swing of the pendulum. Eskom was engineering gone mad. And when I joined Eskom, there were 12 people, I think it's 12 people on the executive committee, then called the board. They were all engineers except for the finance director and the legal manager. Even the HR manager was an engineer. And I thought it was brilliant. Of course, by about 2000, there was not a single engineer on the entire Eskom Exco, but that's the discussion. We were run by a... But to answer your question, I can't... So the answer is yes, it was right, but I'm not going to go that far back. That really is getting into history books. I'm trying to say you've got to think that our industry, the power industry, works on about a 15, 20-year response time. Government's thinking 3 or 4 years in the future. And when you're told to make a tough decision, so in 1997, in the middle of transformation, being told you've got to spend a fortune on a new power station, like, let's go away. Leave me alone. I'm too busy worrying about labour relations and everything else. But multitasking is important. If I was told recently by somebody, sorry, I won't mention who it was, but somebody sent me a tweet. And I was saying we should think about building nuclear, and he said, no, we haven't got time to discuss that at the moment. We must handle a short-term crisis. And I thought, but the short-term crisis is because of long-term putting off of decisions. And today people are saying we mustn't worry about the long-term, fix the short-term. Well, the short-term is a result of the long-term. Sorry, I'm
Thanks, Joe. Two quick questions. One is, you talk about a snag list of, say, whatever the figure is. There is a perception that there are major build quality issues out of the normal for a power plant. You seem confident that's not the case. Maybe just a comment on that.
okay.
And secondly, in terms of unbundling Eskom, is there merit? Does it make sense? And your thoughts on that?
Okay, first one is, I'm not going to say there aren't significant problems at Medupi-Kusile. We had significant problems on most of the Eskom power stations. The problem with Medupi-Kusile is we had no skills base to start with. So it's like saying, go build me a cupboard, and you'll say, I don't do carpentry. Well, build me a cupboard, and the first one you build will be a bit of a nightmare, and the second one will be better, and the third or fourth they'll get really pretty good. So yes, they're there. But I'll give you an example of that. Think of a power station. Letabo. Letabo was built on the top of a clay structure. Nobody realized chopping down the forest would make the water table rise. The water table made the clays heave. That sounds awful. So we had to do massive foundational work at Letabo. It was done. For the first couple of years, Matimba had a problem that the gas ducting that came out of the boilers and goes down into the coolers all cracked up and was terrible. We had 1-inch holes all everywhere. It was fixed. So I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying is we know how to do coal stations. All I'm trying to say is that put it in context. I'll give another context on that one, just important to bear mind. Everyone says the free market does it cheaper. Yes? More efficient and everything else. Small modular units. Well, we have two coal IPPs. They've got struck on problems with financing, but they've got budgets. And they're very proud that these are going to have 40 billion rand worth of investment into the country. That's one of the great statements. And they're going to have 863.5 megawatts sent out between the two of them. If you divide those two together and you work out how much does a 4,332 megawatt power station cost you on the same basis, it's just over 200 billion rand. So in other words, the cost of the IPPs per kilowatt installed, as claimed at the moment, I'm only giving the numbers in the press, is about the same cost per kilowatt as Medupi and Kusile. Should they have been cheaper? Yes. Were they screwed up on? Yes. They were screwed up for a simple reason. Eskom was told until 2004, Eskom in late 90s was told, do not build, do not do anything to do with build. Don't even think about building anything. Don't even think about planning. Don't even think about any preparation work. Wind up your departments, go away. Free market will do it. In 2004, Alec Irwin came in as DPE minister, and he turned around and said, I've got this document called the Energy Policy. And I said, yes. And he said, it says the lights go out in 2007. They said, yes. Is that still going to happen? He said, yes. Well, who's building the power stations? He said, well, the free market's supposed to be, but no one's come to the table yet. Eskom started building power stations. So Eskom went from absolutely no in-house attempt to do anything to being on site with bulldozers on 200 billion rand projects in 24 months. That is not a thing for success. I'm not saying that there wasn't mistakes. I'm quite clear. Medupi Kasili could be cheaper, but don't kid yourself. The real problem with Medupi was the early estimates of time and cost were living in Klaukuka land. They were taking the best possible time in the world of someone who's built stations in a row and said, we'll do better than them. And we took the lowest cost we could think of and we put that number in there. Example is, I think I might saying that the bill of materials for concrete on them originally were 1/3 of the final value. And concrete's concrete. Ever wondered why Medupi starts at 6 and goes to 1? Ever answered your question? You know, we have Medupi goes 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and Kasili goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ever wondered why? Anyone know why? It was very easy. We laid out Medupi so quickly, we hadn't done any geotechnics on the ground at all. When they arrived there with the drilling rig and they drilled holes in the ground to find out what the ground was like underneath the different units, they found out Unit 1's ground was interesting. So he said, better start at the end. That's the level at which we were at. We were going so quickly into that process, we're just saying, do it. And in fact, that even the time for Medupi and Kasili actually isn't too far out from the actual time from initial decision to final power on a well-run project. Just they spend the first 5 years planning it. We didn't spend we spent the first 5 years building it and then fixing it.
Excuse us.
Sorry.
Yeah, and then,
Could you update us a little bit about Pebble Bed, where it is as it affects South Africa, and then internationally, where is it, who's developing it? And could you also talk a little bit about Majuba? You've been very interesting talking about some of the teething problems of these projects. My understanding is that many of these power stations have either been built above coal deposits or very near to coal deposits. My understanding about Majuba is that that was expected to be the case, but it hasn't turned out to be the case, and you'll be able to explain that.
I'm not the only comment on Pebble Bed, because I want to be careful. I don't want to get. I mean, I can go into the nuclear area, and you know, who's here till 3 in the morning? That'll be me going. But I'll leave that. But the answer occurred is that Pebble Bed in this country essentially is dormant. We have technology. We were the world's leaders by far. The guys who are currently just about to start commissioning a PBMR-like machine are the Chinese at a place called Shandong. And they are claiming costs and claiming production of that, which looks very exciting. But that's basically PBMR technology applied by the Chinese. And so if you want my answer, if I give a different answer, if you want ask me as Dave Nicholls, what is the small modular reactor we as a country should be trying to get involved with, it's that reactor. Because we understand high temperature reactors in this country. We were the world leaders 10 years ago. Okay. And the Chinese have actually built it. That's the key thing. To me, there was 5 things I always said about buying a nuclear reactor. So I digress a little bit. Number 1 is, if you're going to buy a nuclear reactor, will you please show me the model I'm going to get? Not drawings. I want to see the physical model that you're currently building, that I can get one of those. Not some piece of paper, a real machine. Secondly, have you built anything reasonably on time and schedule in the last 20 years? Just sort of, you know, if you're claiming everything's a disaster, but you're going to be perfect, I have a problem. Third one is you've got a domestic program, so I've got someone to lean back on. Last one, have you dealt with foreigners? And last one, the last one is have you got is the IP under your control? But the first one is, have you got one that's out there? So all the talk of SMRs, there's about 140 SMR projects in the world, small modular reactors, of which about 1/3 are run by South Africans, by the way. But seriously, the US is running a small modular reactor project from Centurion. Gives me interesting discussions. The engineering office is Centurion, all ex-PBMR people. But essentially the first question is, have you really well built it? Because the problem is not will the science work, not will the efficiency. It's just when you get piece A fitting into piece B, will it fit? Right? And that's a problem. Another question. Majuba, simple. Majuba was built on top of a coal seam. It was wonderful. It was put outside the Mpumalanga area to be away from the environmental problems. And they were very happy with the coal. And they went, sunk the shaft. A long wall mine. They were going to have, a long wall mine is with a long thing. And the first time they drove it, they found igneous inclusions. In other words, all through the coal field, there were lumps of igneous rock sticking up. Hit that with your long wall mine, you end up with So they abandoned the mine. So Majuba was meant to have a coal mine underneath it, which is why Majuba is the place they're looking at the underground coal gasification, because the coal is very good, just you can't mine it.
This is a sort of simple question, but I want you to correct my thinking. The whole sort of press and popular opinion is that renewables are coming and this is going to solve our problem. And I agree with you, it's not thought through, but are we relying on some sort of panacea that the paradigm in storage is going to change in a way that we can't predict now, a bit like cell phone technology or something? Is that a sort of wish list? And that wait a sec, and added to that, you know, right now without storage and not given the fact that, I mean, renewables seem to require a lot of installed capacity and transmission lines we haven't thought about and all those things. But like you said, they're supplying the daytime without this change in storage. And then you've got to keep your big grid supplies, and you mentioned 4 of them, going anyway, because if you don't have that renewable at night and even in the daytime, then you've got to have it anyway. So it's like you've got a little motor car followed by another motor car just in case the first motor car can't supply. So, you know, because what you're saying makes sense to me, and I've always thought the same, but the whole world's talking about renewables are going to solve our problem, and so you're not a PC sort of guy.
Oh, you've noticed that, have you? Good, okay. Well, let me ask a different question. Anybody who wants to, who's got a laptop open because they're bored of this talk, just type in Google and say solar batteries. Right? In other words, ask Google what is the lowest cost way of buying batteries to go with your panels on your roof. Yeah? I mean, in other words, and if you do that, what you will find is a thing called deep cycle lead acid batteries. Right? I'll give you bad news. Everyone says battery technology is moving forward like a rocket. And yet the cheapest battery on the market for doing your solar panel on your roof is lead acid. Right, like your motor car has in it. Invented in 1859. Most of the cost is the cost of the lead. So there's no more learning in lead acid batteries. In fact, by the way, most of the cost of the lithium ion battery is the cost of the materials inside it. The actual markup for processing is quite small. So we've had lead acid batteries, or the cheapest storage available today, electrically, available to us since before utilities were invented. And not a single person on Earth has built a utility scale lead acid battery to back everything up. In fact, what's even more interesting is that Ngula, which we know is a real number, if Ngula's capacity, which is 1,300 megawatts for 20 hours, was actually built as a battery, it would cost about 5 times as much as Ngula cost us. I keep saying us because 35 years I keep thinking of myself as Eskom. I'm not Eskom, this is Dave Nicholls, not Eskom. What that means is that Ngula is 20% of the price of a pump storage scheme, of a battery scheme. Just a small detail, of course, the battery lasts you about, any guesses? 7 years? Give me a choice. 5 years. But it's certainly not. Ngula will be there 100 years from now, still working. We know that. And how many pump storage schemes are in the IRP because of cost? None. So the battery technology in the world, they've been trying to get down to the price of lead acid, which is already 4 times the price of something that isn't competitive. Answer your question? But let me do something else, because you've asked me a question. I did come prepared a little bit. And this, no mouth. This just very quickly in terms of renewables. So I'm not going to use it, pardon me for being a bit rude, but this is the IRP. This is the 2016 one, but the numbers haven't changed much. This is just literally looking here and saying, here is the levelized cost of energy, which doesn't really work with renewable energy cost. It is not a good way of measuring it, but let's just say, this is what it says to us. It says, there you are, there's diesel fuel, gas, mid-merit coal, and there's solar PV and wind. All right? So clearly we should go solar PV and wind. And here's the cost curves for solar PV and wind to the end of the period. We're wonderful, we're great, go with them. But I always believe in looking at the outcome. This is the outcome of the IRP as the price path. Again, it's 2016 one, but it's the same one in 2018, 2019. What you first start off with is the fact that we have to correct Eskom's tariff up to a commercially viable tariff. That's what that first thing does for you. We then run on a steadily increasing one till about here where it starts going up. And at this point here, about 2037, Eskom has essentially ceased to exist. We've got Medupi and Kusile running and that's it. Everything we're looking at is the new stuff. All right? So I've just said the previous graph, same report, says that renewables are the cheapest. The outcome is we go from where we are today with Eskom struggling economically on tariff to something which is almost twice as much for the cheaper solution. And the reasoning is when you say, well, where the heck does that all come from? The answer is that when you buy a classical power station, you've got a big lump of copper rotating at 50 hertz. You've got inertia, you've got stability, you've got dispatchability. If in national control, if they ring up any of the power stations which has an available machine, but it's not, it says, raise your power, he can say, yes, I'll do that. Or he has an inquiry. Unless you've got a red telephone to God, you cannot ring up the PV station at 3 in the morning and say, well, the sun, please rise. So what you've got instead is you've got to have this lot. Now, this is an OECD study under NEA. I know it's the Nuclear Energy Agency, but it's blessed by but it's the OECD, which is that group of countries like USA and vaguely important people. And what they tried to look at was, if you realize that the grid, another thing, if you go back to when I first joined Eskom, if you looked at the generation cost, that was about 85% of the sale price. The grid was 15%. Right? What you've now got a situation where this is the graph. Now, explain this graph. This graph says, and the technologies are gas, coal, nuclear, onshore wind, offshore wind, residential and commercial. This is based upon 6 or 7 OECD countries that put the studies in. So it's not so. What it says is, what is the other cost on your grid besides the generating plant? And I'll start with the easy one, which says gas is the lowest single number. If you've got 10% penetration of natural gas, you've got that little tiny number there. This is in dollars per megawatt hour. And why that is, because I've got to link that thing to the grid. Right? Small part, and the gas is classically in small units. You can put it where you want to. The gas is pipeable, so really you've got no grid problems, you've got no stability problems. Then there's coal, which is slightly more expensive, simply because coal stations tend to be on the coal fields. Therefore, they aren't actually in the middle of the town. So therefore, you've got longer transition systems and everything else. Then you've got nuclear, and they're more expensive still. And that's because nuclear tends to be even farther away from the town. And also, you've got to have a robust grid to make a nuclear safe. So Cape Town has the best grid supply in South Africa, the most stability. Not because of Cape Town. We don't care about Cape Town. It's because Coburg demands it. All right? And so that's why they're. And these costs are the costs you add. So if you've got 30% nuclear on your fleet, on your system, you have to add about $2 a megawatt hour to the average cost of power in the country. That's not the cost of the power from the nuclear power. Then we get to the renewable, gentlemen. And you suddenly start finding you need connections costs, which now become significant. And everyone said, you saw the comment yesterday by Alistair de Reuters, 18 billion rand. And there's a loan a few months ago which Eskom got from some German renewable bank, which is $200 million to allow us to connect 600 megawatts. That wasn't in their budget. That was Eskom's budget of getting the grid to them, because they pay for the connection to the substation. But if you go to the Northern Cape, you'll find there's some really good 400 kV lines feeding 4,000 megawatts into the Northern Cape. In case you've missed it, the Northern Cape hasn't got much industry. And those lines weren't there 20 years ago. They just had to take the solar panel out. Eskom pays for that, the grid pays for that. And then you've got balancing costs and utilization costs and all the rest of it. And I won't, but what it interesting says, if you've got commercial PV with 30% of the market taken up, but their estimate is you've got to add, forget what the cost, if the PV is free, you've got an average increase to your price from the grid side of things of $44 a megawatt hour, which is, what are we, about something like 80 cents a unit. So this OECD study says, and that explains why what starts out as we are cheaper doesn't quite work that way. And then you ask the question, but this is all theoretical stuff, what about the real world? And the real world puts us here, which is a little, I'll leave it for a moment, which simply says, that's just plotting the European prices, so it's simply how much energy you're getting from renewables in your country versus your residential price of power. Let's do a correlation curve, and there's the formula if you want it. And you can see the great success stories are out here. So the real answer is, in terms of renewables, is tell me where in the world it actually works. And if you say something works really well in Germany, then I'm only going to argue that, in fact, their residential tariff is 30 cents a unit. What, that's about 5 rand a unit? 5 or 6 rand a kilowatt hour. That's not where we are. So that's the solution that we're coming to. Sorry, I'm going away.
Thank you. I recently read a report from MTN that they invested 300 million on batteries for their towers.
Yes.
And what is interesting is that they take 18 hours to charge, but they only work between 8 to 9 hours. So the question relates to the 11 projects that they've been requested to say, if the mines were produced, looking at the least cost of commodity, where do they get the other part of the hours to charge their batteries when there's no solar? If you were to be inside.
You're asking me a question. My answer is that it's one of these solutions, which is politically the answer is it's not a problem. Just don't give me the question. I don't know. It was about battery life and things. And as soon as you mentioned, the question was basically batteries take longer to charge than discharge. Therefore, how do you manage the batteries thing? But the bigger problem is more simple than that. MTN's buying batteries because guys are stealing their batteries. Now, we live in South Africa, not in some wonderful part of Scandinavia. And therefore, if you can disperse the grid around the world, then people will walk off with things, I suspect. But the question was about the battery cycling. Don't know the answer to the question. I'm not an expert in that area.
Thank you. We continually hear from Eskom reasons for load shedding, namely wet, cold, faulty conveyor belts, and other what I regard as
Spurious
excuses, if I may use that expression. What is your comment on that?
Okay. Wet cold is famous for the event in 2007, 2008. That's where it first came from. And wet coal came about because Eskom's management at the time thought the best way to run coal stockpiles was as low as possible to avoid having working capital tied up in your stockpiles. So they ran the stockpiles down. And you know, when there was no stockpiles, then what happens to you is your coal stockpile almost sort of self-drains. If it rains on it, you can end up with some bits being dry. If your coal stockpile is 4 days worth, you've got about 30 centimeters of coal on the ground, and if it rains, it gets wet. And we literally had situations where I remember the power station manager at Kendal with a shovel on the end of thing trying to get this coal out through the chutes, because you've got to move that sludge into the mills to get the mills to work. So that's a real issue. It's best solved by having decent coal stockpiles. The other one is, life's a bitch. Things happen. And the answer to the question is we're going to have breakdowns on big power stations. If you've got I come back to it. If you've got no buses in the garage and the bus breaks down on the bus route, you've got nothing to do. 20 years ago, you would have said, oh dear, we can survive for 4 hours. So the idea was, if you think about it, they will tell you we've lost the conveyor belt on some power station. We've got 8 hours of coal in the bins to run before the station shuts down. The normal question was, what can we start up in those 8 hours? Eskom's not had a single machine in cold reserve. In other words, it's worth remembering that since 2007, to my knowledge, and maybe a few that have been, but essentially since 2007, Eskom has not sat with a baseload coal station in cold reserve, able to run and not being run. Period. That's the level you're at. So what was an interesting internal investigation 15 years ago is now oh dear. I mean, things happen. I mean, give you an example. We had once Kendal, they had a fire on their conveyor belts. I investigated, and literally the grass was a grass fire which came across. And long story, the grass hadn't been cut. The fire ran underneath the belts, burnt the belts out, and the belts burst into flames, and they're all rubber. And they then literally had a problem that they had to get the ash out of the power station. They did it, but that kind of thing happens to you, and that's why you have buses in the garage. If you ask the same question of why, what's that company, the bus company that's going bankrupt that can't pay us wages today, literally yesterday? No, it's a subsidiary of Prasa. Autopax. 138 buses on the road out of 500 or so in toto. Eskom was not that bad, but it's that way you're going. And when you get that kind of pressure, then suddenly you really can't maintain things, because as soon as it's half ready to go back, turning around to the minister and saying, I'm not going to go, the load shedding stays on for 2 more days because my engineer wants to do some more work on this plant. You try that one with the minister.
Just a couple of points. So when you had the crisis in 2007, 2008, and we went into a knee-jerk reaction with the whole IDM program. So you're now paying your customers money to buy less power, whereas had you adjusted your tariff, where you actually were having punitive tariffs during your peak demand periods, you would force customers anyway because the returns then are self-fulfilling by actually having load shifting. So that's the one thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is, post-1994, how much did we anticipate the fact that we had a massive portion of the population with no electrification? So irrespective of economic growth, just by trying to get electrification to the population that didn't have it, was going to increase your demand. The third point is, what is your view on CSP, because they're historic?
Okay. Right. Can I start backwards now, because I remember the first one, last one easiest. CSP is the only renewable energy which I really think is wonderful. It's great, works, it's fantastic. Only one small, minor, trivial, unimportant detail: it costs too much. And that's why CSP. So CSP is that concentrated solar plant. So in other words, you've got a whole pile of mirrors heating up oil or some substance which you then store, some salt. And it's a brilliant system. It is the only one that meets the requirements of utility.
Your largest one is in Dubai.
Right. Unfortunately, it all costs way too much money. And it's like people say, oh, but it's cheaper than gas turbines. But Eskom is buying at £5 a kilowatt hour every night from the CSP plant, even when we don't need it. So CSP is if you can get CSP, that's a funny one. Renewables have a funny, I think it's quite funny. There's a range of renewables, and I'll give you extreme cases. One is PV. Very simple, very reliable, very cost effective as long as you don't want power at night. Great, but it's not practical for utility on its own. You then move down the scale, and the most extreme renewable I love is ocean currents, which is physically putting turbines in the ocean, in things like the Gullis current, and taking power. Brilliant. The trouble you've got is that one is totally engineerable but completely useless, and one is totally brilliant but completely unengineerable. And that's the problem. And if you can find one of them, and CSP is the first one across there which sort of works. But unfortunately, we tried it. Its cost has not come down in South Africa of the bid windows. Just of interest, when you're about the cost of power, this is a graph, I steal graphs, I told you. This one comes from Eskom annual report presentation of 3rd July last year. This is the cost of power in Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, That's South Africa and that's Eskom. I don't expect to read the numbers. I will do a sales pitch and say you can forget Argentina because their currency collapsed, so divide 0 by anything, you get 0. So forget them. That's China and India, Canada, South Korea. These are all nuclear countries, aren't they?
No. Canada's
Canada, Ontario Hydro is about, okay. You want that one? I love this discussion. We can have great fun here.
But we don't have time.
Oh, we do. I've got no things. You asked a question about that. This is the only low carbon big grids in the world. Top, 8, right? The best one is France. This is nuclear. That's hydro, other things. Quebec, hydro. Ontario, which is the big Canadian grid, is nuclear and hydro. Sweden is half nuclear, half hydro. They put some other thing. Norway is all hydro. British ones are, and Switzerland's largely nuclear. So if you want to ask the question, is that's the Canada I think of? Yes, large elements of Canada are hydro, but the industrial centre of Canada is run by Ontario Hydro, which is about half nuclear. And just for interest, those are also the cheap utilities, but don't worry, it's not important. It's a mix, but it's a mix because they've got hydro. If you give me... Right, okay, so you go to France.
No, we are hydro.
We don't have any. Well, I've heard a rumour. No, we... the only hydro station... To answer your question, because you've asked a question, the hydro stations Eskom's currently got in this country today, we've got 2 classical hydro schemes, Gariep and Van der Kloof. Between them, 600 megawatts. But those dams are primarily used for agriculture. So Eskom gets told every year how much of that 600 megawatts it can use as baseload. Some years we want it as baseload because there's so much water. Some years we want it as peaking. Pump storage schemes are the best energy systems you can get. We've got several of those in the country. But the only hydro we've really got is that one of the 2 low carbon sources this country's got. One low carbon source is up at Coabassa, which feeds us about 1,500 megawatts into Pretoria. Other one feeds Cape Town, which is Coburg. I'm always amused when the Cape Townians say they want to get a lower carbon footprint for their energy consumption in Cape Town. And you comment that they've had nuclear power there since 1984, so I'm not sure what they're talking about. We'll pass on that bit. But no, we have no hydro. Unless the SANDF can invade neighboring countries and take over Angola. I'm not doing that though.
You refuse to buy.
No, Lesotho's got 80 megawatts of, but Lesotho's water.
To do the deal.
I can't comment on 80 but 80 megawatts is noise.
Yeah, I know that, but you could fish that out of the discussion.
No, it's a flow of water. You'd have the same problem in Lesotho. You'd end up with the water being released to make power when you want it for water consumption. But I'm sorry, I haven't done that. I know I haven't.
Okay. Thank you. Two more questions. Ian? Okay, three. And sorry, I'm still. And your hand up early. Ian.
What I must first say is congratulations. This is the first time I've heard of an admission. We have a crisis. Your first slide is we have a crisis. At least there's an admission. Because government is those in authority who can approve the amount that's got to be spent on new power generation. Is it acceptable when they spend the money?
I didn't try and bring this thing, was not meant to be a solution, but my answer to that question is, okay, I now do agree. The only kind of, if you want to buy a power station, you're going to pay the money. Let's just be quite clear a second. If we as a country are going to buy power generating plant, be it solar panels in IPPs or be it Eskom nuclear or be it whatever it is, you are committing money. If somebody says I want an IPP with a PPA for 25 years, that is on your balance sheet an exposure. And pretending it isn't is a little thing you do. The question is, how can we raise the lowest cost debt to build the most efficient plant? And the funny answer is, if you go and buy a motor car, and you go down the high street and you go into a motor car shop, choose one, BMW, Toyota, anybody, and you say, I want to buy a car, and they say to you, what will they say to you? They'll say, I'll sell you the car, I'll give you a guarantee, I'll give you a maintenance plan, and I'll give you a loan. Yes? Who will lend you money to build new plant? And the answer is the one that you can get it in 10 seconds flat is nuclear. Everyone selling nuclear plants comes with a financial package. I've got two guys, I see Evo, ex-Framatome over there, whatever you call Eve, and I see both of them will say we'll give you debt at about 3% in dollars, which is about 1% real. And you can guarantee that against the PPA. But to answer your question about money, we've got to raise the money from somewhere. Plan B is that we're Nigeria with no oil.
Okay. Can I just...
Oh, sorry.
On power availability.
Yes?
I think you said at one stage, I'm not sure what it was, it sounded like 54,000 megawatts.
What I was saying was that if we had followed on the curve of every other developing country, which is our curve, back into the beginning, we should now be. What I'm saying is in the economy, guess what, a second? What I was saying was that gap there is 20,000 megawatts of heavy industry that we haven't got. That's it.
Okay.
That's our economy.
So if we look at it, say, installed capacity.
Well, installed capacity crossed the line here, that's the point.
That is where?
2007.
Yes, what number is that?
Well, we hit about 37,000 megawatts sent out with about a 42,000 megawatt installed capacity.
And recently you were told that in December, availability was down to 27,000.
Yes, we've got availability is now sitting at about 60% or something for the fleet. I come back to combi taxes.
You've got to put it in before you've got to have the taxis before you can get...
You've got to do something with the taxes, but the short answer is you're running, there aren't any taxes. And that's the problem, is that you can, and what's interesting is the one station whose availability has stayed constant the whole time has been Coburg, not because it's brilliant, because Coburg is forced to do maintenance by the regulator. So we've never shortchanged Coburg on maintenance. So the gas turbines, the hydro and the nuclear tend to have a much different bathtub curve because they all do maintenance driven by a different regime. But the coal fleet was maintained under Eskom's rules that were pressurized by the company and different times the government to make sure we actually make it work.
Last comment. So what we're doing is condemning the country to a growth rate, which is not going to support any sort of growth at all, population growth, with an indeterminate future.
Until somebody recognizes, this is my claim, if I can find the right curve, until somebody recognizes that this solution, which is the real one that matters, which is GDP per head, right? And to turn that round, we've got to start putting in real power stations in real numbers. And you've got to think on a 15, 20-year horizon. You've clearly do short-term things. It's the second argument, you shouldn't be doing things in a hurry at unreasonable cost. But if we're going to if we're going to sort the problem out, this problem here. So I've got a long slide presentation. I apologize for all the slides. Oops. If we're going to sort, we've got to ask, what's going to fill this hole? And I'm saying is now we can just about get things into that hole, right? But the idea of saying these stations that you're going to take Kamati and make it run for 75 years, if you know it's the older station, you really are living in a different universe to me. And people say, oh, but the newer stations are newer stations. They're just newer. That's why we've got this problem here. They'll all move off the end here. I won't.
If we stop giving power to a neighboring country?
No, they're tiny. I understand one of the problems you have here is people talk about numbers and they don't. People talk about big power stations, and I give you an example of battery. Someone mentioned a 50 megawatt battery or something in Australia, which is brilliant. Coburg's house load is 50 megawatts a unit. So you understand people get very excited about things that are very small. People talk about, we're going to bring a power barge at 100 megawatts. You know, these things. My answer is no. We need several thousand megawatts, and we need to get the reliability of this fleet up. But unfortunately, you've got really old fleet, no time, no money.
There was a press report on a strategy from Eskom out a couple of months ago, so it might be old, and I don't think Mr. DeRuyter was there yet, but they were saying that Eskom should commit to 25,000 megawatts as a base load, and then they could put the rest into maintenance, and within a couple of years they could get that up to, say, 40,000. I mean, you're an engineer, you know Eskom. Is that feasible that they could commit to 25,000 megawatts, and then we could go and look for energy somewhere else? Is that a possible solution?
I'm not sure whether somewhere else is. I saw someone says we should import more power from our neighbours, and there is no more neighbours. I'm just going to comment that a certain chairman of Eskom apparently resigned because he promised not to load shed over Christmas. We're in a game where things are unpredictable, and I don't. A different discussion. The biggest thing that the public have to understand, in my view, is that I can imagine the morale in Eskom is completely shot. They've been told they're incompetent, useless, they're going to lose half the jobs, blah, 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 blah. Coming to work at 3 in the morning to try and keep to clear a chute, a coal chute which is clocked up with sludge with a spade is not something you get excited about. So the answer is, if there's no belief.
If you said that you give Eskom a couple of years to do maintenance, in other words, 25,000, whatever it is, the commitment, then you've got a couple of years where you don't have to commit to supplying every single morning. I mean, is that feasible, that maintenance could...
You'll find a new country.
Okay.
I mean, the keep the lights on is real. You cannot turn people off. We are seeing I would argue that we are seeing the socio-economic result of the lack of growth because of the lack of power because of decisions made in the 90s. And phantom solutions that come up with says, oh, renewables will do everything.
Thank you.
She's shutting me down now.
Yes.
I'll go away.